poor rancher for years, until he buys an Apache widow who changes his life. The wind howled across the plain, stirring the dry, cracked earth beneath the rancher's boots. For years, he'd fought against the elements, against time itself. His ranch, once a thriving patch of land full of cattle and crops, now seemed like little more than a forgotten relic of a better time. The crops had failed again. The cattle were fewer than they'd been last year, and the bills, those ever-growing bills, piled up, never giving him a moment's peace. It had always been like this, ever since his father passed on the ranch to him. The rancher had tried to keep the land running, tried to keep it alive just like his father had. But no matter what he did, the land refused to cooperate. The rains didn't come, and when they did, they were far too little, too late. The soil had become like stone, unwilling to give life to anything he planted. He had borrowed money, he had sold off pieces of land, and still the ranch struggled. The rancher sat at his kitchen table, a small cup of coffee in his hand, but he didn't taste it. The world outside was quiet, too quiet. No sounds of animals, no cattle calling, no birds overhead, just the relentless silence of a failing dream. He ran a hand through his hair, staring out at the horizon. It was difficult to believe this was the same place his father had once bragged about, the same place he'd heard stories of from his grandfather. A rich legacy of land, of cattle, of hope. What had gone wrong? Why had the ranch turned its back on him? He could feel the weight of the ranch's history pressing down on him. It wasn't just about the land. It was about family, legacy, pride. For all his efforts, it seemed that the land was destined to fail him. No matter how hard he worked, it never seemed to be enough. The rancher stood up and walked out the door, stepping onto the porch. He wiped his hand across his face, feeling the rough stubble that had been there for days. He hadn't felt the need to shave in weeks. There hadn't been time. He had spent every waking hour on the ranch, trying to save what little was left. There was always work to do, fixing fences, mending equipment, caring for what few animals had survived the harsh winters. The land was unforgiving. His neighbors had offered their sympathy, but sympathy didn't pay bills. It didn't feed cattle or grow crops. He had heard rumors of others abandoning their ranches, selling off their land, heading to the city or further west. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. There had to be a way. There had to be a solution. As he walked across the yard, he glanced at the few animals left grazing by the dry creek bed. A handful of cows and horses, looking as worn and weary as he felt. They were the last remnants of the once thriving ranch. The rancher walked over to the stable, where one of his oldest horses stood, its coat dull and its ribs showing. He reached out a hand, stroking the horse's mane, as if to apologize for not being able to do more. It had been a hard year, but he wasn't ready to quit. He couldn't just walk away from his family's legacy. He couldn't let it slip away. The ranch had been his father's and his grandfather's, and it was supposed to be his too. It wasn't supposed to end like this, with the land drying up, the crops withering, and the animals dwindling. He knew he couldn't do it alone, but where could he turn for help? For a moment, he thought of the town nearby, but he didn't feel like facing the pity in their eyes. They knew his struggles. They knew his plight. No one could help him, not in a meaningful way. He'd thought about selling everything, but what would he do then? There were no other jobs, not out here, and the thought of abandoning the land left a sour taste in his mouth. So, he continued to work. He worked long hours, pushing himself past exhaustion. Every day he tried a new tactic, planting something different, trying new techniques, hoping the land might change its mind. But it didn't. One evening, as he was on his way into town for supplies, he overheard a conversation at the local store. The old man behind the counter, a man who'd seen the rise and fall of countless ranches, was speaking to a group of settlers who had gathered there. The conversation shifted from crops to the latest gossip about an unusual auction. The rancher wasn't interested at first, but the words that followed caught his attention. A woman, an Apache widow, was being sold at auction. He listened as the man described her, how her husband had been killed in a skirmish with settlers, and how with no family to turn to she was being sold to the highest bidder. He didn't know why the thought struck him so strongly, but it did. The idea of a widow being auctioned off like cattle disturbed him. He'd heard of such things happening before, women in desperate circumstances, traded as if they had no value beyond what someone was willing to pay. He knew it wasn't the same as buying cattle, but there was something about it that gnawed at him. He thought about his ranch, about how he couldn't keep it going alone. He thought about the loneliness that had settled in his heart, the emptiness of working the land day after day with no one to share the burden. He knew it was a strange thought, but as the hours passed, the more he considered it. Maybe the auction was his chance to change things. Maybe he could help this woman, this widow, in some way. Maybe she could help him too. The rancher didn't have much to offer. He had no wealth, no luxuries, but he did have land. He had space for someone who needed a place to be. As he prepared to leave the store, the conversation still lingered in his mind. He had no idea what was to come, but he knew one thing. He had to try something, anything, to turn his life around. Maybe this was the way. Maybe it was the answer he'd been searching for. That night, after a long day of work, the rancher sat on his porch, staring out into the vast, empty land. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if he was making the right decision. But one thing was certain. He couldn't continue living like this. If there was even a small chance for something better, something new, he had to take it. The next day, the rancher couldn't shake the conversation from his mind. It haunted him as he worked under the hot sun, trying once again to fix the fences that had been broken for weeks. The old boards creaked under his hands, the nails stubborn and rusted. Every task felt heavier than the last. But through the exhaustion, the thought of the auction lingered, nagging at the back of his mind. As the day wore on, he felt a strange pull to the small town again, as if something were guiding him to take action. The idea of the auction, of buying the Apache widow, was strange, but something about it seemed right. Perhaps it was the need for change, or perhaps it was simply the desperation for something new in his life. By midday, he made the decision. It wasn't just about the woman being sold, but about his own future, about finding a way out of the rut he had been stuck in for so long. He needed help, and maybe, just maybe, she needed a chance at a new life too. It wasn't a fairy tale solution. He knew that, but what did he have to lose? After finishing his work on the ranch, he headed into town, his mind made up. The auction was set for that afternoon, and he arrived at the town square just as the first bidders began to gather. The dusty street was lined with horses and wagons, and people milled about, chatting in small groups. The rancher could feel the tension in the air. This wasn't just any auction. It felt different. The stakes were high, and for reasons he couldn't fully explain, it felt as if his own life was about to change forever. He found a spot at the back of the crowd, keeping to himself as he watched the proceedings unfold. The auctioneer, a tall man with a booming voice, called out to the crowd, his words carrying over the chatter. Soon the widow was brought forward, and the rancher's heart skipped a beat. She was a striking woman, though her features were hardened by years of hardship. Her skin was dark and weathered by the sun, her eyes full of a quiet strength, but also a deep sadness. Her long black hair was braided, and she stood still, her hands bound by simple ropes. There was no fear in her expression, only a sort of resigned acceptance. The rancher's eyes met hers for a brief moment, and it was like time slowed. He could see the pain in her gaze, but there was something else too, something he couldn't quite place. It was as if she too knew that her life was at a crossroads, and whatever happened today would shape her future. But even in that fleeting moment, he felt a pang of sympathy. She wasn't just a woman being sold. She was a person, a survivor, just like him. The auctioneer's voice snapped him back to reality. "All right, folks, let's start the bidding," he shouted, his eyes scanning the crowd. The rancher hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had never been to an auction like this, let alone been part of one. The thought of bidding on a person, a human being, made him uneasy. He knew it wasn't right, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this was his chance. The rancher glanced around, noticing the other men in the crowd. Most of them were rough-looking settlers, ranchers or traders, men who seemed more interested in the price than the person they were bidding on. It made him feel even more certain that he had to step in. $200! A voice called out from the crowd. The rancher swallowed hard. It was a low price, but there was no telling how high the bidding would go. His hand clenched around the small bag of coins in his pocket. He didn't have much, but he had enough to take a chance. He took a deep breath and raised his hand. $250, he called out, his voice steady though his heart was pounding in his chest. The auctioneer turned to him with a sharp nod. The bidding paused for a moment, and the rancher felt the eyes of the crowd shift toward him. The widow didn't move, but her eyes flickered in his direction. Was that surprise? Hope? He couldn't tell, but there was something about the way she looked at him that made his heart race. The other men grumbled, but no one else raised their bid. After a tense moment, the auctioneer called out, "Sold!" to the man in the back. The rancher felt a mix of relief and apprehension wash over him. He had won her. He didn't know what he had just done, but he knew that it was too late to turn back now. He walked forward, his boots heavy on the dusty ground, and handed over the bag of coins. It was the last of his savings, but he didn't care. In his mind, he had just made a decision that would change everything. As the widow was released from her ropes, she didn't speak. There were no words of thanks, no gratitude. She simply nodded once, as if acknowledging that this was her new reality. The rancher looked at her, unsure of what to say. She didn't seem angry or upset, just calm, almost indifferent. He wasn't sure what kind of life she had led, but he knew one thing. He couldn't let her be another forgotten soul. "Come with me," he said quietly, his voice low and uncertain. She glanced at him, and for a moment he thought she might refuse. But then, without a word, she turned and followed him. They walked together in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air between them. The rancher led her back to his wagon, and as they rode away from the town, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. What would happen now? Could this woman really help him turn his life around? Or had he just made another mistake in a long line of them? As the town faded into the distance, the rancher looked over at her. She was sitting quietly beside him, her eyes forward, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the spark of hope flicker inside him. Maybe he couldn't fix everything, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to help each other. The ride back to the ranch was a quiet one. The rancher could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Beside him, the widow sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. The wagon creaked and jolted as they made their way across the rough terrain, but neither of them spoke. It wasn't the uncomfortable silence of strangers. It was the silence of two people who had both lived through too much to say anything meaningless. As the rancher guided the horses toward the ranch, he tried to imagine what the widow must be feeling. She had lost her husband. She had been auctioned off to the highest bidder like a piece of livestock. She was now on a strange ranch, with a man she didn't know, a place that could be as lonely and harsh as the one she just left. He couldn't even begin to understand the depths of her pain, but he could relate to the sense of isolation. They were both alone in their own ways, trapped by circumstances that seemed too big to escape. The rancher pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the small house he called home. The wind had picked up, carrying the dry dust across the yard, and the air was colder than it had been when he left. He felt a chill run through him, but it wasn't from the cold. It was the reality of what he had done. What now? "Welcome to the ranch," he said quietly, his voice sounding almost hollow in the stillness. He didn't know if she would even respond. He didn't know what to expect. She glanced over at him, her expression unreadable. Her dark eyes met his, but she didn't say anything. After a moment, she nodded once, acknowledging his words in a way that was distant but not unfriendly. Then, without a word, she stepped off the wagon and walked toward the small house. The rancher followed behind her, unsure of how to act. He had spent so many years on his own, learning to survive, to handle everything himself. The idea of sharing his life with someone, let alone someone who had been through so much, was both a relief and a burden. He didn't know what to do next, but he had to start somewhere. "Let me show you to your room," he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. She nodded again and followed him into the house. The ranch was small, but it had everything they needed. The walls were sturdy, the floors clean, and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. The widow didn't look around, didn't seem to care about the simplicity of the place. Her gaze was focused elsewhere, and the rancher couldn't help but wonder what memories haunted her. What had she seen? What had she endured? When they reached the small room at the back of the house, the rancher opened the door for her. It was a modest room with a simple bed, a dresser, and a small window that overlooked the backyard. It wasn't much, but it was hers now. The rancher stood in the doorway, unsure whether to say anything. She glanced inside, then back at him. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but steady. It wasn't much, but the rancher felt a small weight lift from his chest. At least she hadn't rejected him outright. She was willing to stay, at least for now. "I'll make dinner," he said, trying to keep things normal. "It's not much, but it'll keep us going." She nodded again, but didn't speak. The rancher went to the kitchen and began to prepare a simple meal. He didn't know how to cook much, just some beans, bread, and a bit of meat from the last cow he'd butchered. It wasn't fancy, but it was food. As he worked, he thought about the widow. She hadn't asked for this. She hadn't asked to be bought or brought here. She had been forced into a life she never wanted, and now she was here, on his ranch, with him. Was he making a mistake? Was this just another way for him to try and fix his broken life? He didn't have answers, only the quiet hope that things could get better. The silence between them was heavy, but it was better than the loneliness he had grown used to. They would find a way to make it work. They had to. Dinner was simple, but the rancher put everything he had into making it as good as he could. As he set the table, he tried to think of something to say. Maybe he could ask her about herself, about her life before she came here. But he didn't want to press her too hard, not yet. She had already endured so much. The last thing he wanted to do was make her feel like she was being forced into another uncomfortable situation. When the widow came into the kitchen, she hesitated for a moment before sitting down at the table. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if she were still processing everything that had happened. The rancher sat across from her, unsure of how to start the conversation. He didn't know what was appropriate to ask, what she was willing to share.
"This is all I have," he said, motioning to the meal.
"I'm not a good cook, but I can get by," he chuckled softly, trying to make light of the situation. She didn't respond right away, but after a moment she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "It's fine," she said quietly. "I'm not hungry, but I'll eat." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight he couldn't ignore. He wasn't just talking about the food, Blaine shod. She was talking about everything, her life, her past, her loss. The rancher didn't push her to eat or speak. Instead, they sat in silence, the quiet hum of the fire the only sound in the room. That night, the widow went to bed early. The rancher stayed up for a while, staring at the flickering flames in the hearth, lost in his own thoughts. His life had changed in the span of a single day, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. But there was no turning back now. He had taken a chance, and so had she. In the days that followed, the widow began to settle in. She didn't speak much, but she helped with the work around the ranch. She seemed to know what needed to be done before he even had to ask. She worked the land with a quiet strength, tending to the animals, gathering herbs, and helping with the chores that the rancher couldn't handle alone. Though they rarely spoke, a bond began to form between them. It wasn't the kind of bond he had expected. It wasn't love or friendship, but something different, a quiet respect for each other. They were both survivors, and somehow they had found their way to each other. The rancher didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if this would be the start of something good or just another chapter in a long line of mistakes. But for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. The days that followed felt like a quiet transformation. The rancher had always been used to working alone, living alone, but now, with the widow's steady presence, everything seemed different. It wasn't just that there was more work getting done. It was something deeper, a shift in the air, as though the land itself was responding to the change. The rancher began to notice the small things, the way the widow moved, the way she worked the land, the way she seemed to know exactly what needed to be done, even before he did. It wasn't just the chores. It was how the widow brought something new to the ranch, something that hadn't been there before. The rancher found himself waking up earlier, moving with a new sense of purpose. The tasks that once seemed insurmountable now felt achievable. The land, though still dry in parts, had begun to show signs of life again. The cattle, though still few in number, were healthier. The rancher began to hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. One afternoon, after a long morning of tending to the fields, the rancher sat outside, wiping the sweat from his brow as he looked out over the land. It was still far from perfect, but it was better. The work was hard, but it felt meaningful. He glanced over at the widow who was standing by the creek washing some clothes. The sound of the water flowing was peaceful, a sharp contrast to the exhausting work of the ranch. Her movements were fluid and efficient, and for the first time the rancher felt like they were building something together. He hadn't expected it. He hadn't expected her to become such a vital part of his life, but there she was, and in her quiet way, she had changed everything.
The rancher stood up and made his way over to her.
She glanced up as he approached but didn't say anything. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar, like they both understood that there was no need for words. "How's the water?" he asked, his voice rough from the long day. "It's fine," she replied, her voice low but steady. She set the clothes aside and looked at him for a moment, her dark eyes studying him. "The creek is still running strong. It's good for the land. Good for the animals." The rancher nodded. He knew that, but somehow hearing her say it made it feel more real. It was a small thing, but it was something he hadn't thought about much. He had been so focused on keeping the ranch alive, on surviving day to day, that he hadn't stopped to think about the small blessings. The water in the creek. The way the sun set every evening. The way the widow, even without saying much, had breathed new life into everything. They stood together for a while, watching the creek flow. The rancher was lost in thought when she spoke again. "You know," she said softly, "I've never been good at trusting people. Not after everything that's happened." The rancher turned to look at her. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed quiet, giving her the space to continue. "But this place... it's different," she said, her voice steady but tinged with something he couldn't place. "It feels safe here." Safe. The word echoed in his mind. It wasn't something he had ever thought about before, not in this way. The ranch had always been his responsibility, his burden. It always felt like he was fighting to survive, to keep things going. But now, for the first time in years, he wondered if it could be more than just a place to survive. Maybe it could be a place to heal.
"I'm glad," he said quietly.
"I'm glad you're here," she nodded, but said nothing else. The rancher didn't push her to say more. Instead, they both stood there, side by side, watching the water flow. It was a simple moment, but it meant more to him than he could put into words. As the days passed, the widow became more comfortable on the ranch. She started to share more about herself, little pieces of her past. She would talk about her life before the auction, about her family, about the life she had lost. The rancher didn't ask for details, but he listened. He could hear the pain in her voice, the ache of someone who had loved and lost, who had been through more than anyone should ever have to endure. But there was strength in her, too. A quiet strength, the kind of strength that could survive anything. They worked together, side by side. It wasn't always easy. There were still days when the land refused to cooperate, when the tasks felt too much. But they were a team now, and that made all the difference. The widow's knowledge of the land, her quiet determination, had turned out to be just what the ranch needed. One morning as the rancher was out checking the cattle, he found himself thinking about the past. He thought about how different things had been just a few months ago, when he had been on the edge of giving up. Now, with the widow by his side, everything felt possible again. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if they would be able to make the ranch truly thrive again. But he knew one thing for sure. They were doing it together, and that made all the difference. The rancher stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands as he looked out over the land. The morning sun had just begun to rise, casting a warm glow over everything. It wasn't perfect, but it was getting better. And that was enough. As he walked back to the house, he could see the widow working in the garden. She was bending over, tending to the plants, with a quiet focus. He paused for a moment, watching her, and a thought crossed his mind, something he hadn't allowed himself to think about before. Could he be falling in love with her? The idea was strange. He didn't know how to process it. They had come together out of necessity, out of desperation. But somewhere along the way, things had shifted. They had built something here. They had built a life.
But he didn't say anything. There was no need.
He wasn't ready to put words to what he felt. Not yet. For now, he would keep working, keep building, and keep moving forward. There was still so much to do. And as long as they had each other, he knew they could face whatever came next. The seasons changed, as they always did, but this time it felt different. The rancher could feel it in the air. The summer had been long and hot, but with it came a renewed sense of purpose. The widow, once a stranger in his life, had become a constant presence. Together, they had worked through every challenge the land had thrown at them, and now, for the first time in years, the ranch was beginning to show signs of real promise. The crops were growing, though slowly. The cattle, once weak and malnourished, were beginning to fill out, and there was more food in the larder than the rancher had ever imagined possible. The widow had a way with animals, a calmness that the rancher admired. Her quiet voice seemed to soothe even the most skittish horses and cows, and soon the ranch felt alive in a way it hadn't for as long as he could remember. For the first time, the rancher felt that maybe, just maybe, the land would be kind to them again. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. He had changed too. The days of working alone, of carrying the weight of the ranch on his shoulders, seemed distant now. The widow had brought something to his life that he hadn't even realized he was missing: companionship. He wasn't alone anymore, and in her, he had found something he hadn't expected. Someone who understood the quiet ache of loneliness. Someone who had been through her own struggles and yet still found the strength to move forward. As autumn settled in, the rancher found himself looking at the land in a new light. It wasn't perfect and it wasn't easy, but it was his, it was theirs. And together they had made it work. The ranch was more than just a piece of land now. It was a symbol of their hard work, their resilience, and their partnership. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting a warm golden glow over the fields, the rancher sat on the porch, watching the widow as she worked in the garden. The wind carried the scent of freshly turned earth, and the sound of rustling leaves filled the air. It was peaceful, in a way that was hard to put into words. Everything around him felt still, like the world had paused for a moment, allowing him to take it all in. He had never imagined this. Never imagined that he could share his life with someone, not after everything that had happened. But here they were, standing side by side, both of them scarred by the past but still moving forward. They had built something together, and it was stronger than either of them could have done alone. The rancher watched the widow for a moment longer, her movements graceful and sure as she worked in the garden. She had become more than just the woman who had been auctioned off to him. She was his partner, his equal. And in the quiet moments, like this one, he found himself thinking about how far they had come. As the widow finished her work, she turned and walked toward the house, a small smile on her face. The rancher stood up to meet her, his heart heavy with the weight of everything they had been through. The silence between them was comfortable now. They didn't need words. They had been through too much, and now they both understood each other in a way that no one else could.
"I've been thinking," the rancher said, his voice quiet.
The widow raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. About the future, he said, a little unsure of himself. About what comes next. The widow nodded as though she had been expecting this conversation. She didn't seem alarmed, just thoughtful. The rancher took a deep breath, unsure of how to put his feelings into words. "We've built something here," he said, motioning to the land around them. "Together. And I don't know what's ahead, but I think we can face it. We've made this ranch work, even when it seemed impossible. And I think we've both found something here." The widow didn't respond right away, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. She walked closer, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the distant calls of animals in the field. "You're right," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "We've both found something here, a place where we belong, a place where we can start over." The rancher felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just the words. It was the way she said them, the way she looked at him. She wasn't just agreeing with him out of politeness. She meant it. They had both found something they hadn't expected when they had first come together. It was more than just survival. It was a new beginning. The next few months were filled with hard work, as they always were. But the rancher no longer felt the crushing weight of isolation. With the widow by his side, everything seemed possible. The days were still long, the work still exhausting, but now there was a shared sense of purpose. The ranch was thriving, and so was their bond. One evening, after a long day of work, the rancher found himself sitting on the porch once again, this time with a feeling of contentment he hadn't known in years. The widow sat beside him, and they looked out at the land they had worked so hard to revive. The stars began to appear in the sky, twinkling brightly above them. "It's different, isn't it?" the rancher said, his voice soft. The widow nodded. "It is, but it's ours now." For the first time in a long time, the rancher felt at peace. He had no idea what the future would bring, but he knew one thing: they had made it together. They had built something strong, something real, and whatever came next, they would face it side by side. As the night settled in, the rancher took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. He looked at the woman beside him, and for the first time he truly understood what it meant to have a partner, to have someone who not only shared in the work but in the dreams too. They had both started with nothing, but now they had everything they needed: a home, a future, and each other. And that, he realized, was all that mattered.